Okay, now let's move to biological evolution. Okay, so how does the Earth's life change over time? Okay, the scientific theory of evolution through natural selection explains how life on Earth changes over time due to change in the genes of population, and populations evolve when genes mutate and give some individuals genetic traits that enhance their abilities to survive and to produce offspring with these traits. And that is what we call the natural selection. Okay, so biological evolution by natural selection explains how life changes over time. But before we explain natural selection, first we have to define some terms here. Okay, so most of what we know about the long history of life on Earth comes from fossils. Okay, let me So most of what we know about the long history of life on Earth comes from fossils. Okay, so fossils are mineralized and petrified replicas of skeletons, bones, teeth, shells, leaves, and seeds or impressions of such items found in rocks. Okay, scientists have found such fossil evidence in successive layers of sedimentary rocks such as limestone and sandstone. And they have also studied ancient pollen from samples of glacial ice. The body of evidence gathered through the use of this method is called the fossil record. Okay, this record is uneven and incomplete because many forms of life left no fossils and some fossils have decomposed. And scientists estimate that the fossils found so far represent probably only 1% of all species that have ever lived. So imagine that, okay? The scientists have only found probably only 1% of all the species that have actually ever lived. Okay? That is actually based on the fossil record. So how did we end up with such an amazing diversity of species? So the scientific answer is what we call the biological evolution or simply evolution. So when you say evolution, it's actually the process whereby the Earth's life changes over time through changes in the genes of populations of organisms in succeeding generations. Okay? So according to the scientific theory, species have evolved from earlier ancestral species through what we call the natural selection. Okay, so in this process, individuals with certain genetic traits are more likely to survive and reproduce under a particular set of environmental conditions and to pass these traits onto their offspring and than are individuals without these traits. Okay, so a large of body evidence supports this idea. As a result, biological evolution through natural selection has become a widely accepted scientific theory that generally explains how life has changed over the past 3.8 billion years and why life is so diverse today. However, there are still many unanswered questions about some of the details of evolution by natural selection, and research continues in this area. Okay, so first we're going to discuss is biological evolution by natural selection. It actually depends on the genetic diversity. Okay, so the idea that organisms change over time and are descended from a single common ancestor has been around in a one form or another since the time of the early Greek philosophers. But no one had developed an explanation of how could this happen until in 1858, naturalists Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace independently proposed the concept of the natural selection as a mechanism for biological evolution. Darwin meticulously gathered evidence for this idea and published in his book in 1859. And do you know the title of that book? That book is actually called the On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Okay. So biological evolution by natural selection involves changes in a population's genetic makeup through successive generations. Recall that a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular space. Note that population, not individuals, evolved by becoming genetically different. Okay? So the first step in this process development is what we call the genetic variability. So when you say genetic variability, it's actually the variety in the genetic makeup of the individuals in the population. And this will occur because of mutation. So when we say mutation, it is the changes in the DNA molecules of a gene in any cell that can be inherited by offspring. Okay, so during an organism's lifetime, the DNA in its cells is copied each time one of its cells divides and whenever it reproduces, and millions of times in all. Okay, so there's what we call the so in biology there's what we call the genetic uh, copy. Okay, or we have the meiosis division where our cell divides. Okay, and when our cell divides, meiosis and mitosis. Okay, so when our cell divides, the DNA also replicates and also copied a million times in all. Okay, and most of the mutation results from random changes in the DNA's coded genetic instructions that occur in some tiny fraction of this million times. And why are these mutations happens? Because of these are some of the factors that affects the mutations in the DNA. In the DNA, these are actually external agents such as radioactivity, ultraviolet radiation. So when we are exposed to large amount of radiation, then it could mutate our DNA. Okay, especially from the sun, and of course, certain natural and human made chemicals, or what we call the mutagen. Okay, so those that can create mutations, those chemicals that can mutate our DNA. Okay, so mutations can occur in any cell, but only those that take place in the genes of the reproductive cells are passed on to offspring. Sometimes a mutation can result into a new genetic trait, or what we call the heritable trait. Okay, so heritable trait is a mutation as a new genetic trait that is results by a mutation. Okay, which can be passed from one generation to the next. In this way, populations develop genetic differences among their individuals, and some mutations are harmful to offspring and some are beneficial. Okay, so some mutations can be harmful to offspring, and some can be beneficial. Okay, so the next step in biological evolution is what we call the natural selection. So in which environmental conditions favor some individuals over others. Okay, so the favored individuals possesses heritable traits that give them some advantage over other individuals in a given population. And such a trait is what we call the adaptation or adaptive trait. Or it's any heritable trait that improves the ability of an individual organism to survive and reproduce at a higher rate than the other individuals in a population are able to do under prevailing environmental conditions. Okay. So an example of natural selection at work is what we call the genetic resistance. Okay. So genetic resistance is the ability of one or more organisms in a population to tolerate a chemical such as pesticide or antibiotic designed to kill it and to reproduce more rapidly than the members of the population that do not have such a genetic trait. So like for example, we have the antibiotic resisting bacteria now. Okay. So if we wrongly use antibiotics, so it can actually cause or it can result to antibiotic resistant bacteria. Okay, that's why antibiotics now should have you cannot buy antibiotics in the pharmacy the without the consent of the doctor. Okay, so you should have consent first the prescription of the doctor in order for you to buy the antibiotic. Because if we wrongly use antibiotics, okay, so it can actually create what we call genetic resistance. Bacteria can create genetic resistance. Okay, so genetic resistance can develop fairly quickly in populations of organisms such as many species of bacteria and insects that can rapidly produce large numbers of offspring. So, for example, certain disease-causing bacteria have developed genetic resistance to widely used antibacterial drugs or antibiotics. Okay, so they can actually create an antibiotic resistance. Okay, if we wrongly use antibiotics. Okay, and to kill bacteria. Okay, so our own species is another example of evolution by natural selection. We have evolved certain traits that have allowed us to dominate most of the Earth's land area and many of its aquatic systems. Evolutionary biologists attribute our success to three major adaptations: strong opposable thumbs that allowed us to grip and to use tools better than few other animals that have thumbs could do, an ability to walk upright, which gave us agility and freed up our hands for many uses, and a complex brain which allowed us to develop many skills, including the ability to use speech and to read and to write in order to transmit complex ideas. Okay, so humans is also an example of a natural selection. Okay, because we have hands and we have the ability to walk, which gives us agility, and also we have the complex brains which we can think, we can speak, we can read, we can write, and we can transmit complex ideas uh, with other humans. Okay, so to summarize but before that, okay, so evolution, this is an example of a bacteria that could create a genetic resistance. Okay, evolution by natural selection. So a population of bacteria is exposed to antibiotic. Okay, so of course the bacteria can be killed by the antibiotic. Okay, but but except those bacteria that has the trait that makes them resistant to drug. And because of this, the resistant bacteria could be multiplied eventually and replace all other non-resistant bacteria. Okay, so eventually, from time to time, those bacteria that are actually present now, that species bacteria would have a genetic resistance. Okay, so that's the implication for uh, uh, that we are using wrongly antibiotics. Okay, and that is also uh, the example of what we call the genetic resistance. To summarize the biological evolution through natural selection, okay, so genes mutate. So the process of biological evolution by natural selection is that genes mutate, individuals are selected, and the resulting populations are better adapted to survive and reproduce under existing environmental conditions. Okay, so genes mutate, then after that is natural selection, or individuals are selected, and the resulting populations are the ones that have the strong genes and have the abilities to survive under drastic environmental conditions or changing environmental conditions. Okay, so now let's go to the limits in adaptation. Okay, so adaptation through natural selection has its own limit. In the not too distant future, will adaptations to new environmental conditions through natural selection allow our skin to become more resistant to the harmful effects of UV radiation, our lungs to cope with air pollutants, and our lives to be better detoxify pollutants in our bodies? According to scientists in this field, the answer is no, because two limitations on adaptation to natural selection. Number one is a change in environmental conditions can lead to such an adaptation only for genetic traits already present in a population's gene pool, or for traits resulting from mutations which actually occur randomly. Okay? So only those genetic traits that are actually present in already in the populations can lead to such an adaptation, and also for traits resulting from mutations, and these mutations can only happen in random. Okay, so it's actually not all the time. Okay, so that means that that there is no chance that we can actually uh, we can actually have a better adaptation on the environment from time to time, okay? Because a change in the environmental conditions uh, can lead us to an adaptation only if there is a resulting mutation, okay, on our DNA. But as we all know that if there is a mutation on our DNA, this can actually uh, can nowadays, if we can say, we can hear mutations on the DNA. If there is a mutation on our DNA nowadays, that is actually what we call, there is actually a disease or an illness that is actually happening inside our body, okay, or inside in our cell. Okay, so if there's a mutation on our genes, okay, so and not it's not about environmental adaptation, but it's actually disease, or it's actually an illness that we are actually that is inside our body, okay. So when we say about mutation, and secondly is, even if a beneficial heritable trait is present in a population, the population's ability to adapt may be limited by its reproductive capacity. Populations of genetically diverse species that reproduce quickly, such as weeds, mosquitoes, rats, bacteria, and cockroaches, often adapt to a change in environmental conditions in a short time. By contrast, species that cannot produce large numbers of offspring rapidly, such as elephants, tigers, sharks, and humans, take a much longer time, typically thousands or even millions of years, to adapt through natural selection. Okay, so it takes for us humans to actually adapt through natural selection. So it takes millions of years or even thousands of years for us. So there are also myths about biological evolution through natural selection. So there are a number of misconceptions about biological evolution through natural selection. And here are the four common ones. Number one is the survival of the fittest means survival of the strongest. Okay, so that is the number one myth. Okay, so the biologist, fitness is a measure of reproductive success, not strength. Okay, so thus the fittest individuals are those that leave the most descendants and not those that are physically strong. Okay, so they are the ones that have that can produce a large of offspring or descendants. Okay, so when we say survival of the fittest, that means that we can produce or leave most descendants rather than not those that are physically strong. So that is the number one myth about evolution. So when this number two is evolution explains the origin of life. So it actually does not. However, it does explain how species have evolved after life came into being. So it's not explains the origin of life, but it does explain how species are evolved after life came into being. Thirdly is that humans evolved from apes and monkeys. So actually humans, apes, and monkeys evolved along different paths from a common ancestor that lived 5 to 8 million years ago. Okay? And lastly is that evolution by natural selection involves a grand plan of nature in which species are to become more perfectly adapted. And there is no evidence of any such plan. Instead, evidence indicates that the forces of natural selection and random mutations can push evolution along any number of paths. Okay, so those are the myths about evolutions. So, what are the factors that affects biodiversity? Okay, so and how do new species arise? So, but before that, let us take some of the terms that are usually used in this topic. Okay, so under certain circumstances, natural selection can lead to an entirely new species, and this is what we call the speciation. Speciation. Okay, so when say speciation, one species splits into two or more different species. Okay, for sexually producing organisms, a new species forms when one population of a species has evolved to the point where its members can no longer breed and produce fertile offspring with members of another population that did not change or that evolved differently. Okay, so the most common way in which speciation occurs, especially among sexually reproducing species, is when a barrier or a distant migration separates two or more populations of species and prevents the flow of genes between them. This happens in two phases. The first is what we call the geologic isolation, and the second one is the reproductive isolation. Okay, so these are the factors that affects the biodiversity. So when we say geographical isolation, is that occurs when different populations of the same population of species becomes physically isolated from one another for a long period of time. For example, part of the population may migrate in search of food and then begin living as a separate population in another area with different environmental conditions. Populations can also be separated by a physical barrier such as flooding, stream, or a new road, a volcanic eruption, or a geological process, or winds or flowing of water that carry a few individuals to a distant area. And these separated populations can develop quite different characteristics. Okay, so that's the geographical isolation. So they are only being isolated on that environment for over a long period of time. That means that it could affect the biodiversity of that land, because there will be no other species that could come, or that could migrate into that place. Okay, or even if it will be migrated, but it could also be separated because of the environmental conditions. Okay, so therefore there is no passing, or there is a barrier between the passing of the genes from one species to another species. Okay, so therefore biodiversity will be affected by geographical isolation. Okay, the second one is, so this is an example of the uh, geographical isolation. Okay, so for example is the poison dart frogs. Okay, so living on different lands or in different parts of the region can have dramatic differences in the coloration of the dart frogs. Okay, so these poison dart frogs vary in coloration partly because they were exposed to different environmental conditions. So if they are different, if they are not being isolated with uh, with only one type of environment, then they could have different a variety of species, just like this poison dart frogs. Okay, so however, if only one frog is just being isolated to one place, then there will be no other species of the dart frogs will exist. Okay, so that means if they are exposed to another environmental conditions, then there possibly a new species will arise, or there will be a biodiversity of species that will lead to it. Okay? So another factor that affects the biodiversity is the reproductive isolation. Okay, when I say reproductive isolation, is a mutation and change by natural selection operates independently in the gene pools of geographical isolated populations. So if this process continues for a long enough time, members of the geographically and reproductively isolated populations of sexually reproducing species can become so different in genetic makeup that they cannot produce live fertile offspring if they are rejoined and attempt to interbreed. As a result, one species has become two and the speciation has occurred. So scientists have found fascinating ways to study speciation and evolution. For example, molecular biologists and emerging National Geographic explorer Beth Sapiro and analyzes DNA samples from the fossils of ancient animals and plants and uses statistical models to discover the course of evolutions of populations over time and territory. Okay, so this information could be used to help devise strategies for protecting species today. And humans having an incredibly increasing larger effect on the Earth's biodiversity, okay, could uh, affect the biodiversity of species by manipulating and combining the genes of species. So humans nowadays have the ability to manipulate the genes by combining the genes of the species by what we call the uh, artificial selection. Okay, so artificial selection change the genetic characteristics of a populations with similar genes. By number one is when we select or more desirable genetic traits in the population of the plant or animals, then after that we selectively breed it or crossbreed it to generate populations of the species containing large numbers of individuals with desired traits. So this is what we call, like for example, we're going to breed species of dogs, okay, like Shih Tzu or Bulldog. Okay, so we are going to breed them or we crossbreed them to produce species with our desired traits. Okay, so that is also one way of that humans can actually manipulate or combine genes. Okay, so other ways is that humans can actually now scientists can actually use genetic engineering, okay, to speed up the ability of manipulating the genes of the genes of the to manipulate the genes, okay? And in this process, the genes, scientists can alter the genes, organism genetic material by adding or deleting or changing the segments of its DNA to produce desirable traits or to eliminate undesirable ones, okay? So like for example, you have the modified genetic engineered modified crop plants, okay, like GMO. Have you heard about GMO? So that is actually genetically modified objects, okay? Or like for example, you have GMO rice already and other crop plants. We have also new drugs and pest-resistant plants and animals that grow rapidly, okay? So genetic engineering also enables scientists to transfer genes different between different species that would not interbreed, okay, in nature. Okay, so example of this is for genetic engineering is this one. Okay, so you have the larger Atlantic salmon was genetically engineered with a growth hormone from a Chinook salmon. Okay, and the smaller fish is an unmodified Atlantic salmon. Okay, so that's it. So that's the effect of the genetic engineering. And the other one is the new and rapidly growing form of genetic engineering is what we call the synthetic biology. Okay, so it's a technology that enables scientists to make a new sequences of DNA and to use such genetic information to design and create new cells, tissues, organisms, and devices, and to redesign existing natural biological system. Okay. So the last topic for this chapter is about extinction. And all species eventually become extinct. So another factor affecting the number and types of species on Earth is what we call the extinction. So extinction is the process in which an entire species ceases to exist. Okay, this is also referred to as a biological extinction. When environmental conditions change dramatically or rapidly, a population of a species faces three possible futures or results. Okay, if there are change in environmental conditions. Number one is that species could adapt to new conditions through natural selection. It could migrate, if possible, to another area with more favorable conditions, or it could become extinct. So species that are found in only one area are called the endemic species. Okay, just like your generalist species. Okay, they can only be inhabited only on one area or can be found only on one area, and they are more uh, vulnerable to extinction. Okay, so this exists. So they exist on islands and other unique areas, especially in tropical rainforests, where most species have highly specialized roles. Okay, for these reasons, they are unlikely to be able to migrate to adapt in the face of rapidly changing environmental conditions. Okay, so many of these endangered species are amphibians, such as the now extinct golden toad. Okay, so these are example of endemic species. Endemic species are actually specialized species. Okay, so throughout most of the uh, Earth's long history, species have disappeared at a low rate, and this is what we call the background extinction rate. Okay, so the rate that existed before the human population began growing exponentially. Okay, in contrast, a max extinction is a significant rise in extinction rates above the background rate. In such a catastrophic, widespread, and often a global event, large groups of species are wiped out primarily because of major widespread of environmental changes. Okay? Fossil and geological evidence indicate that there have been at least three and probably five mass extinction during the past 500 million years. A mass extinction provides an opportunity for the evolution of new species that can fill an occupied ecological niche or nearly created ones. Scientific evidence indicates that each occurrence of mass extinction has been followed by an increase in species diversity over several million years as a new species have arisen to occupy new habitats or to exploit newly available resources. As environmental conditions change, the balance between speciation and extinction determines the Earth's biodiversity. The existence of millions of species today means that speciation on average has kept ahead of extinction. However, evidence indicates that global extinction rate is rising dramatically, and many scientists argue that this and other evidence indicate that we are experiencing the beginning of new six mass extinction. And there's also considerable evidence that much of the current rise in the extinction rate and the resulting loss of biodiversity are primarily due to human activities. As our ecological footprint spread over the planet, research indicates that the largest cause of the rising rate of species extinction is the loss, fragmentation, and degradation of the habitats. And that is all about extinction.